So today on the podcast, we continue our story of Walt's lost mini parks. So far in our series, we have looked at a mini park that Walt wanted to develop in 1939 in Burbank, a set of regional kiddie parks in the late 1950s, the park at Monterey developed with Del Monte Properties, and various versions of the second gate that Walt once envisioned for land just outside Disneyland. And today, we're shifting over to Florida for the story of a mini park that was designed and partially built until ultimately it became something else. This is a story that begins in Walt's final year of life and then continues into the years after his passing. So, if you're ready, let's go. In 2010, the world of cinematic theme parks changed when Universal Orlando opened a lushly detailed 20-acre themed land wholly focused on one movie franchise, the 8-film Harry Potter series. The land included an inventive attraction, restaurant, shops, and a massive recreation of Hogwarts Castle. The new land was a tremendous success, demonstrating that the public was interested in deeper and more engaging film experiences inside of a theme park. In this case, spending hours wandering through the world of Harry Potter, perhaps imagining that you are a student at Hogwarts. Disney quickly responded with a range of single IP lands, among them a 12-acre Cars land that opened in DCA in 2012, a 12-acre Avatar-themed land that opened at Animal Kingdom in 2017, and a 14-acre Galaxy's Edge at Hollywood Studios and Disneyland. One movie or one movie series, one land. But among major park designers, Universal Creative wasn't the first to at least propose and partially build a 10 to 20 acre area focused on a single film or a single film series. Disney explored this idea back in the early 1970s with what might be described as an 11-acre mini park just across the way from the Magic Kingdom. The gated area was going to be themed after the Disney live-action film Treasure Island, released in 1950, about 23 years before design work began in earnest on this project. And here, let me first put the Disney film Treasure Island in a historical context. At the time I record this, the first Harry Potter film is 24 years old, which still remains popular. By the early 1970s, Disney had already shown the movie Treasure Island on TV, dividing it up into 2 one-hour segments for its weekly anthology show. But audience interest in this film remained so strong that the company planned to re-release it to theaters in the mid-1970s in conjunction with a new Treasure Island-themed mini park that was designed to open in 2 phases at Disney World. This mini park, situated on an island in Bay Lake, would feature recreations of various sets from that movie. One large set of a shipwreck in the first phase, with other large sets planned for the second phase. The island now is better known as Discovery Island, an island that was once a botanical and zoological garden open to the public. But before it was Discovery Island, it was eyed to be a life-sized 11-acre recreation of that iconic island from the 1950 Disney film. A mini park that didn't develop exactly as planned. But in all of this, there's a larger story, and here let's key up some pirate music. Before Disney arrived in Florida in the mid-1960s, the island, the one that would later become Treasure Island at Disney World, had many names. It was called Ross Island, and it was referred to as Idle Bay Isle by one person who lived there for years, But the name that stayed with it was Riles Island, after Joel Riles, who owned it for nearly a decade at the start of the 1900s. Riles Island was the name you'd likely find on a map. The island transferred hands many times in the first half of the 20th century. But the most interesting owner of Riles Island was Delmar Nicholson, son of a naturalist and taxidermist who had an interest in both wildlife and nature. He owned it in the 1930s and 40s and remained there living as a tenant in the early 1950s after he sold the island to a couple living out of state. In circles of deep Disney World history fans, Delmar Nicholson is better known as Radio Nick. The popular story is that he got his name as a radio announcer. While it is true that he read the news, weather, and farm reports in the 1930s and 1940s on WLOF and WDBO, Orange County's first radio station, that's not where he got his nickname, especially as he was only on air a couple of times a week. He got the name because he was a radio bug, a kid who was interested in electronics. Since childhood, he had been interested in radio transmissions and the new field of what we'd now call electrical engineering. He was known as Radio Nick because he designed, built, and repaired radio equipment. He owned a radio shop in the 1920s and then another in the 1930s. That second shop was called Radio Nick, located about a block from Lake Eola in downtown Orlando. He was the local dealer for RCA. But Nick had interests beyond the radio. He was also interested in tourist, educational, and leisure attractions involving animals, an interest that he had inherited from his father. In the early 1930s, he developed and later operated the city's first municipal zoo, which was planned for public land just off of Garland Avenue in downtown Orlando, again a couple of blocks from Lake Eola. "I'm sure," he said, "that with some expenditure of energy, we could have a zoo here that would be better than those in Sanford and Kissimmee." Like other zoos in the region, it would present mostly local animals such as deer, snakes, a bear, birds, and alligators, in an effort to educate locals, particularly area school children, about Florida wildlife. The animals were gathered up by Nicholson and locals, including what was described as a giant alligator lassoed out of the swamp by the city's mayor, Vernon Wilson Estes. Beyond local animals, a sheriff, Henry Hand, also donated his pet monkey after it bit his secretary, and Nicholson at least had plans for a lion enclosure. While the Orlando Zoo, or what some locals were starting to call the Orlo Zoo, was being developed, some of the animals already caught or donated stayed at the Kissimmee Zoo. For the small zoo, rocks were trucked in, as were plants, enclosures were arranged, as well as areas where school children might receive lessons about wildlife. Much of the labor was done by the WPA, which was a federal New Deal program designed to employ millions across the country during the Depression. For a short while, this park was loved by locals. The small zoo remained open until the late 1930s when problems in maintenance led to its closure. Animals kept escaping, including deer, monkeys, and raccoons. The reasons were clear. The Orlo Zoo simply didn't have enough volunteers or personnel to manage the facility. The city converted the land in the late 1930s into a bird sanctuary, with enclosures removed and the animals sold or given to other zoos. The only enclosure that remained was the bird aviary, which was repurposed for the sanctuary. As the zoo project was moving toward its close on November 19, 1937, likely with money made at his Radio Nick store in downtown Orlando, Delmar Nicholson purchased land where he might be surrounded by a few animals and also a range of interesting plants similar to those that once existed at his zoo. Specifically, he bought Riles Island in Bay Lake and also a good deal of the land that surrounded it. On the island, he cultivated limes, mangoes, and other fruit. He grew exotic plants, including orchids. He kept birds, including some that were so gentle with people that he presented them as pets. He held open houses for years during the Sunday and Monday of Labor Day weekend, where guests could meet the most famous of his birds, a gentle sandhill whooping crane, and they could also visit his lemon groves. He provided the food and drink for his guests, but during the war years he asked guests to bring sugar for their own lemonade, as sugar was then being rationed. Though he owned hundreds of acres, the only part of his vast holdings that was developed was the island, which contained a cypress house, a structure that he apparently added on to as needed using local cypress wood. Nicholson owned the land until 1949 when he sold it to a couple in Oklahoma, though he continued living there with the new owner's permission into the early 1950s. At least in name, the island and some of the surrounding land was owned by the Oklahoma couple until November 1955, when they sold it to 10 businessmen who collectively wanted to have access to private land where they might vacation. They called their small group the Bay Isle Club, what realistically might actually be considered the very first timeshare on the future site of Disney World. In all, the Bay Isle Club purchased 1,128 acres. Their initial plan was to subdivide some of the land out and sell it for homes, though they intended to keep the island for their own use, as a group-owned parcel to be used for vacations, though they were also open to, as they said, letting any of the local civic clubs borrow the island for meetings and other gatherings. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the group took vacations there and used it for family celebrations, including birthday parties. The plans to subdivide and sell plots for houses, it seems, never really materialized. At this point, the island, in terms of its 20th century history, had a very unusual pedigree. It had been owned by a person interested in tourist attractions and who even used the island as a small tourist attraction itself after the Orlo Zoo was closed, to teach people about the natural environments of Florida, the possibilities of new crops, and to meet his birds. It was also owned by a group who used the land as a place of vacation hospitality. The next owner, the Walt Disney Company, would ironically be interested in combining these two interest areas, developing a tourist attraction and combining it with vacation hospitality. The first time that Walt Disney presumably saw this island, or at least an island that others would later believe was the one in Bay Lake, was on a plane trip home from developing attractions for the New York World's Fair in November 1963. After New York, the group flew south to visit areas around the Gulf Coast and to scout other locations by air. Already, Walt was considering land in Florida for an East Coast Disneyland. The group would visit Tampa, but Walt wanted land further from the beach. At the end of the trip, he directed the company pilot to fly them over the center of the state, in part so he could see the land near the state's highway system. While in the air, he focused on land west of Orlando, down what is now called the I-4 corridor. According to Joe Fowler, who oversaw construction at Disneyland and was with him on this trip, "We flew over the lake and the property in the Disney World, and Walt said, 'This is it.' Just like that, no question." Even in this story, it might be possible to assume that from that height, Walt might have been looking at nearby property, as Central Florida is dotted with lakes with islands. But the key development of this story is not so much the exact lake that Walt eyed, but rather, from the start, Walt was drawn to property with a large water feature. This would come up again when Disney lawyer Bob Foster, along with a team of other lawyers, bankers, and brokers, began to buy property in Central Florida. Walt impressed upon them the value of a lake for a vacation destination, a lake perhaps with an island in it. As Bob Foster and his team worked to buy parcels, Walt and Roy needed to stay out of Florida, as news of a possible Disney resort would drive land prices up. Through some complicated negotiations, Foster was able to buy tens of thousands of acres in Central Florida, including a combined parcel that included Bay Lake and the island where Radio Nick once lived. Though locals knew that someone or some company was buying up a lot of land, and of course there was community speculation about this, which at times included Disney, Foster was able to keep the actual owner a secret for about a year and a half, largely because all key Disney members avoided visiting Florida. But once the news was out, Walt, Roy, and others from the company came out to Orlando both to formally announce the project and to tour the property. Many on the team whose earlier experience had been to convert well-maintained orange groves and farmhouses in Anaheim into Disneyland were shocked by what they saw. The Disney acres in Florida were a big open space with no improvements, no paved roads, few services, a land filled with unfamiliar and possibly dangerous animals. But this was where they were going to build a second Disneyland along with hotels near the lake with the island. One member of the planning team, art director Bill Martin, recalled that Bay Lake looked, like tea. It was all brown. There was a lot of snakes, a lot of wildlife. There was cattle being grazed there on the place at that time. Armadillos were just all over the place. You couldn't drive down anywhere without armadillos running out in front of you. This was also Walt's first opportunity to inspect his purchase in person in November 1965, including the island. At this point, the island was more or less as Radio Nick had left it. Bob Foster, who was deeply familiar with the Disney property, cataloged what was on the island. The island was occupied by a house, a strange assemblage of rambling rooms that seemed to have been one room added onto the next at someone's inspiration, but without plan or logic. There was a dock, some storage sheds, and a fascinating solar water heater that worked. Semi-tropical plants, trees, ornamental and fruit-bearing still thrived on the island. And here is where things get interesting. The next chunk of the story comes from Craig Linton, co-founder of the company Florida Ranchlands, who was one of the brokers who helped Bob Foster secure acreage in Central Florida. "We worked for 6 months, not knowing who the mystery buyer was," Linton explained. "And then we worked for a year knowing who the buyer was, while no one else knew." In 1965, Linton was one of the people who personally helped arrange Walt's visit out into the swamp and cattle land that he had purchased. "We even brought air-conditioned Jeeps up from Fort Lauderdale," he continued. And these Jeeps brought Walt and others out to the property, also to Bay Lake. We had boats arranged to take them out to the island. He got off that island and said, "Well, here's Treasure Island right here." This suggests that Walt had some vision, perhaps a vague, undetailed vision, that the island might be a way to include material from his 1950s live-action feature into the new resort, a feature that wasn't in his California park. Let me add in one more thing here. The quoted interview with Craig Linton took place in early 1973, before Disney announced any plans to develop that island with a movie theme. So he's not using the framework of a later development to explain what Walt saw. He's offering what he remembers of that trip. By the time of this interview, early 1973, Linton had long ago moved on from Disney and was then working with other clients. Walt had an idea about creating larger themed areas in and around the Magic Kingdom. Themed areas that would move beyond the park itself and into hotel spaces. For example, he wanted to build a hotel area themed to colonial America next to Liberty Square, with both of the areas taking their cues in part from the 1957 Disney live-action feature about the American Revolution called Johnny Tremaine. He imagined a number of these themed hotel spaces, one with a Frontierland theme, another theme to Main Street. Nearly all of the themed hotels that Walt imagined for the Florida resort fell away from the plans, with one exception, the Polynesian Hotel that he imagined just across the water from the Magic Kingdom. The other hotels that were designed and approved in the late 1960s after Walt's passing likely appealed more to Roy with his sense of business travel. But inside of what Walt had actually envisioned for the resort, an island theme to the movie Treasure Island makes a lot of sense. Not far away from a large resort area themed to America during the 1770s and another themed to Polynesian living. Walt was imagining small 10 to 15 acre developments around different visual motifs. Assuming the Treasure Island theme was a concept that Walt wanted to pursue, and it does look that way, this version of Treasure Island falls away from the overall plans, or at least it becomes muddied, in the years after Walt died, same as did various themed hotels. Walt toured the island in November 1965. In December 1966, he passed away. Following his passing, a pirate theme loosely stays with both Bay Lake and the man-made Seven Seas Lagoon. But the names in all this are jumbled around. It appears as though designers after Walt's passing remembered that Walt wanted to incorporate a pirate theme into the Disney World Islands, but without his guidance, this was handled in a very loose fashion. When Disney World opened in 1971, between Seven Seas Lagoon and Bay Lake, there were a total of 5 named islands or shore areas. All of the islands around the Poly had tropical names, such as Beachcomber Isle, and all of the island and land areas closer to the Contemporary had pirate-related names. In this jumble, though, Riles Island in Bay Lake, which is by far the largest island and the only one suitable for development, was renamed Blackbeard's Island. The land outcropping next to the Contemporary was named Shipwreck Marsh, and then inside Seven Seas Lagoon, the island closest to the Contemporary was called Treasure Island. That is the name for the large island, the one that Walt once saw as tied to his 1950 movie, was shifted over to the smallest of the islands in the lagoon. As work progressed on the resort, Disney had plans to create a natural picnic and playground area on that island in Bay Lake. In the 1969 master plan, Disney described Blackbeard's Island as a young explorer's paradise. By March 1971, a little over a half year before the resort opened, this plan was further revised, this time with detail. Blackbeard's Island in the center of Bay Lake will be a truly fun place for kids. The natural little isle will have a shipwreck especially made for youngsters to romp around on. Families can explore the island and have picnics on its shore. But these elements, largely, weren't developed on the island before the resort opened, almost surely because Disney needed to focus labor on other more important projects, such as the Fort Wilderness Camping Ground, which was months behind schedule. When the resort opened, the islands were actually reachable by guests, by sailing, swimming, or boat. Today, the Disney resort is pointedly cautious about gators and snakes in or near the water. But this was not always the case some half-century ago. From August 1971, I have one photo of 60 lifeguard applicants standing in Bay Lake behind the yet-to-be-finished Contemporary Hotel, where they were asked to swim for 450 yards. This would be halfway to the island and back. Rental sailboats were arranged as a sailing and swimming activity for guests. This here is from one early press release the week before opening. You can rent a sailboat for as little as $4.25 an hour, and the water in the hotel areas is safe to swim in. So essentially, guests were free to just dive off rented sailboats and swim where they like. One of the first conventions booked at Disney World from the Rollins College Alumni Association, announced in the summer of 1971 but planned to take place in April 1972, had plans for a cookout and class party on Blackbeard's Island. Lastly, Disney at least considered, I'm not sure if these plans were ever enacted or not, an evening swim for guests led by a lifeguard from the deck behind the Contemporary out to the island and back. The distance one way was about 400 meters, about 8 times the length of an Olympic pool. And this is pretty much the state of the island and Bay Lake for Disney World's first 2 years. But then Disney eyed the island as a place of expansion. By 1973, somewhat oddly, the names of the island had been again switched around. The name Blackbeard Island was shifted over to the small island in Seven Seas Lagoon, and miraculously, the name Treasure Island was shifted back over to Bay Lake, to the island that Walt visited and envisioned as a representation of the island in his movie. The first announcement of a future development for that island appeared in April 1973 as a project with 2 phases. Phase 1 in the development of the picturesque island in Bay Lake, the announcement began, involves walkways, small lakes, and waterfalls. Later, the island will be developed as a themed adventure based on the Walt Disney motion picture, with scenes to visit from Ben Gunn's Fort to Benbow Inn, including the wreck of the Hispaniola and a peg-legged pirate to lead the tour. And in this, you have a version of themed areas taken from the film Treasure Island. Ben Gunn, I should point out, was the character who had been shipwrecked on that island for years, an island with treasure and caves and some structures. And leading the island tour there at Disney World was a peg-legged pirate. This certainly sounds like an animatronic descended down from the Tiki Room. And here again, there's a larger context in terms of design shifts at Disney World. In part, the more robust pirate theming of the island seems tied to guest interest in Pirates of the Caribbean. When Disney World opened in 1971, it had no Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, as designers felt that with the actual Caribbean so close by, visitors wouldn't want to see a theme park recreation of it, especially as they could also visit nearby museums focused on historical pirates. But Pirates of the Caribbean was the most requested attraction to be added into the park, as many visitors had seen images of the famous ride on the weekly Disney TV show and were now disappointed not to find it at the Magic Kingdom. Pirates was the first large attraction to be added to the resort. Also, the opening of Pirates of the Caribbean would create an opportunity to cross-promote a second pirate adventure over on Bay Lake. Essentially, one TV commercial to advertise the 2 related editions. The goal initially would be to premiere Pirates of the Caribbean inside the Magic Kingdom at the end of 1973. At the same time, the resort premiered the Treasure Island themed area in Bay Lake, though it did eventually take an additional 4 months for the island to open. Crews moved over tons of dirt and gravel to create paths and elevated areas for later show spaces, such as the Benbow Inn and Ben Gunn's Caves. Largely, they raised the center of the island, so that from its midpoint it gradually sloped down to the water. This added elevation also allowed for ponds and waterfalls to be placed on the island. We had the goal to raise the grade, in some places as much as 15 feet, said Bill Evans, longtime Disney landscape architect. We thought in terms of recreating or simulating a treasure island, a real tropical island which would have several purposes. It would be an adventure and a zoological gardens. The crew brought in plants and built enclosures for birds and other small animals. They also built one large feature tied to the film, namely the wreck of the Walrus, a ship that once belonged to the bloodthirsty Captain Flint, the pirate whose treasure was hidden on the island. Evans understood that they were creating a mini-park, that they were moving widely apart from anything Disney had done in California. They also brought in hundreds of birds, flamingos, peacocks, toucans, black swans, and a locally caught bald eagle who had been injured in the wild. The eagle was only one of a few sick or injured birds entrusted to Disney by government officials, believing that caretakers on the island would be able to nurse most of them back to health. The hundreds of birds had access to commercial bird food, fresh meat, as well as fruits and vegetables from Disney kitchens. Some birds still chose to hunt inside of their enclosures, catching local lizards and frogs. The hunting and scavenging instincts of one group of birds even caused problems. A half-dozen buzzards who lived in one enclosure, which also featured an artificial human skeleton, repeatedly took apart that skeleton's fiberglass bones to check to see if there might be meat on them. The skeleton had to be repaired repeatedly by Imagineer Lee Toombs, a woman best known for playing Madame Leota on a film loop inside the Haunted Mansion. When it opened, Treasure Island was oddly more focused on natural exploration and zoological exhibits than it was on stage areas that resembled the movie, aside from that one wrecked ship. The island was largely a collection of paths, suspension bridges, boardwalks, bird enclosures, ponds, and areas of natural beauty. But most of these areas held pirate names, from Rum Point to Scavenger's Beach to Black Dog Bridge to Buccaneer's Roost. Additional themed areas from Treasure Island were initially planned for Phase 2 of the development. These included Ben Gunn's Cave, where likely the treasure would be hidden, a second ship, the Hispaniola, driven ashore and wrecked by pirates, a small mound of climbable rocks called Spyglass Hill, and a structure arranged as a lookout called the Blockhouse. In this, the small island would be a collection of outdoor sets that would allow visitors to sink down into what at that time was one of Disney's best-known live-action movies. Landscape architect Bill Evans also recalled that the original plan was to develop certain areas of the island like a themed Disney area, and then use tropical plants to create a South Seas feeling elsewhere, along with a handful of animal exhibits. We were thinking, Evans explained, originally just maybe a few monkeys and macaws, the sort of brilliant colored parrots that you identify with the tropics, but the bird idea caught on. The birds essentially were popular with guests and reasonably easy to care for. From there, the focus of future developments moved away from outdoor stages and play areas themed to Treasure Island and more to a 10 or 11-acre zoo largely focused on tropical birds, with aviaries and places where guests could meet macaws and other parrots. Also, for those guests who actually wanted to visit an island playground, they could visit Tom Sawyer's Island over in the Magic Kingdom. That is, the Treasure Island project shifted away from a cinematic theme and more toward the type of small zoo that Radio Nick had once imagined for downtown Orlando. The island changed names and in 1977 was called Discovery Island, a name more fitting for a small zoological area. Discovery Island is the name that most longtime Disney World fans recall. At this point, Radio Nick, founder of that original Orlando Zoo project, was still alive and still living in the Orlando area. Back in the early 1960s, he had managed floral departments for local Publix markets. In the late 1960s, he sold houseboats in Winter Garden with a 38-foot model tied up at the city dock. In 1974, the year that Treasure Island opened, Radio Nick and his wife lived out in the west end of the county on a lake overlooking Walt Disney World. The house was off State Road 535, which is one of the roads that moves right past the Disney Resort. He lived in the same place when Treasure Island became Discovery Island in 1977, an attraction with its focus on exotic plants and birds that must have seemed like an elaborate expansion of the way he had arranged that island decades earlier. Radio Nick would live for another year until 1978. There's a good chance that Radio Nick visited the small park in the middle of Bay Lake, either as Treasure Island or Discovery Island. But there's no record of what Radio Nick thought of the small zoo that Disney created on the island where he once lived. As for the Disney Island, it remained there as a zoological garden, mostly removed from the Treasure Island theme until 1999, a year after Disney opened a far larger and more successful zoological park, Animal Kingdom, on the other side of its massive property. Simply, Disney World didn't need two zoos. Though the full version of that Treasure Island project, a mini park that recreated scenes from just one movie, was never fully built, it was a harbinger of things to come. Like some other Disney projects, such as Fantasia back in 1940, its design premise was simply ahead of its time. Perhaps the world wasn't quite yet ready for a 10-acre adventure focused on just one movie, but if you move the dial of time forward by about 35 years, you would find an American public far more steeped in the culture of film and TV, who was eager to step into lush and large recreations of the worlds they saw up on the screen. The American public of the early 2000s was so entranced with film experiences that they would want to spend time in a 10 or 14 or 20-acre themed area that recreated environments from one film or from one film series. This was more or less Disney's original underlying design conceit for the island in Bay Lake, to create an immersive mini park focused on just one film. But an idea the public wasn't fully ready to accept, but a concept whose underlying goals would pair perfectly with people in the early part of the 21st century. Again, a slightly different outro for today. Throughout this series, I've been pointing listeners to related series over on Bandcamp. This time I want to point to a series called The Water, The Wavemaker, and The Secret Hotel. This is a series about the development of Disney World in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. It includes the story of the famous Wavemaker in Seven Seas Lagoon. It also includes the little-known story of the hotel Disney planned to build on the Atlantic coast of Florida in the 1970s as a type of remote extension of Disney World, with land they purchased before the resort opened in 1971. But in terms of our episode today, it also includes the story of Bob Foster's efforts to buy the land for Disney World, which touches on the materials that we've discussed here today with Bay Lake and Treasure Island. As always, I'll be back next week with a new episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney Studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.